के हो? What most people mean when they speak of logic. Using strict logical form, deduction holds that if all the statements in the argument are true, argument मा भएको सबै statement यदि true हो भने, the conclusion also must be true. The other method of moving from evidence to conclusion is inductive reasoning. एउटा deductive भयो, अर्को inductive reasoning. Induction proceeds from individual observation to a more general conclusion. Individual observation देखि from a more general conclusion and uses no strict form. त्यसमा खासै strict कुराहरू राखिँदैन. It requires only that all the relevant evidence be stated and that the conclusion fit the evidence better than any other conclusion would. Conclusion, it will fit the evidence than any other type of better evidence that we would do for conclusion. Most written arguments use a combination of deductive and inductive reasoning. धेरै written argumentहरू जति छ, they use the deductive and inductive reasoning, but it is simpler to discuss and illustrate them separately. Example, illustrate means giving example. It is very simpler to discuss गर्न एकदम simple चिज छ, and it is illustrate means giving example separately. Using deductive argument. How can we use deductive argument? The basic form of deductive argument is syllogism. What is syllogism? Syllogism is a term which consists of a major premise which is general statement. एकदम सानो सानो statement, सानो कुराहरूलाई राख्ने. A minor premise which is a related but more specific statement. Related छ र धेरै भित्रसम्म पुग्ने specific. And a conclusion which is drawn from those premises. So you can get these examples. Major premise, all Olympic runners are fast. Minor premise, Jace Owens was an Olympic runner. Major चाहिँ सबैलाई भन्यो. Minor premise चाहिँ के भने एउटालाई particular गर्यो के specific बनायो. Conclusion, therefore, Joyce Owens was fast. Now, turn your book at page number 280. As you can see, if you grant both the major and minor premises, then you must also grant the conclusion. Major and minor दुवै premises राख्दा, please you need to think about the conclusion what you are going to include over there. In fact, it is the only conclusion you can properly draw. Major minor जुन भए पनि एउटालाई particular draw गर्नु पर्यो. You cannot reasonably conclude that Jesse Owens was slow because that conclusion contradicts the premises. Nor can you conclude, even if it is true, that Jesse once was tall, but the conclusion goes beyond the premises. हैन? Tall भएर अग्लो भएर जित्यो भन्न चाहिँ मिलेन, हैन? But what your conclusion must be premise. हाम्रो conclusion चाहिँ कस्तो हुनु पर्यो भने we must go to grant the conclusion, and this is the only conclusion that we can properly draw. We cannot reasonably conclude. हामीले reasonable conclude चाहिँ कस्तो गर्न सक्दैनौँ भने you was tall so you won the race यस्तो भन्न चाहिँ मिलेन. The argument seems obvious and it is much simpler than argumentative essay would be. Argument simpler देखिन्छ. Yes, it is obvious and it is much simpler than an argumentative essay would be. In fact, a deductive argument premises can be fairly elaborate. The Declaration of Independence, which appears later in this chapter, has at its core a deductive argument that could be summarized in this way. Major premise, tyrannical rulers deserve loyalty. Minor premise, King George III is a tyrannical ruler. Conclusion, therefore, King George III deserves no loyalty. यसरी चाहिँ हामीले सबैलाई एज अ होल भन्नु पर्दा मेजर प्रेमाइज भयो, कसैलाई पर्टिकुलर भन्छौँ भने त्यो माइनर प्रेमाइज भयो र त्यसको कन्क्लुजन भनेकै that is what we are going to decide in our essay. The measure premise is a statement that the declaration claims is self-evident. Measure भनेको self-evident आफैले खोज्ने हो. So obvious that it needs no proof. यसलाई proof चाहिएन. Much of the declaration consists of evidence. कतिलाई तथ्य कुराहरू चाहिन्छ. And most of the declaration consists of evidence to support the minor premise that King George is a tyrannical ruler. The conclusion, because it is drawn from those premises, has the force of irrefutable logic. The king deserves no loyalty from his American subjects, who are therefore entitled to revolt against him. When a conclusion follows logically from the major and minor premises, then the argument is said to be valid. When we go to a conclusion which follows logically from the major and minor premises, major र minor premisesलाई follow गर्दै हाम्रो argumentation जान्छ भने that is a so the if the syllogism is not logical, the argument is not valid. यदि हामीले दिएको example logical छैन भने the argument will not be valid. So the conclusion is not sound. For example, you can see here कस्तो खालको conclusionहरु चाहिँ sound हुँदैन, meaningful हुँदैन त भन्दा major premisesमा all dogs are animals, माइनरमा all cats are animals हो, dog पनि animal हो, cat पनि animal हो भने all dogs and cats are animal हुने भयो हो हाम्रो बुझाइमा. तर यसले कन्क्लुजन के ल्याउनु भयो भने dogs पनि animal हो, cat पनि animal हो भन्यो भने dogs are cats. Now it is not a good conclusion and it is not an acceptable conclusion. यो acceptable पनि हुँदैन. यस्तोलाई चाहिँ हामीले के भन्छौँ? This is not a logical conclusion. Of course, the conclusion is absurd, but how did we wind up with such a ridiculous conclusion when both premises are obviously true? The answer is that the syllogism actually consists two major premises. Both the major and minor premises begin with all. दुवै major र minor premises all बाट सुरु हुन्छ. Therefore, the syllogism is defective and the argument is invalid. Consider the following example of an invalid argument. हेर्नुस् त invalid argument कस्तो हुन्छ त जुन valid हामीले मान्न सक्दैनौँ. Invalid arguments are major premises all dogs are animal, minor premises Ralph is an animal. Conclusion, therefore Ralph is a dog. Here an error in logic occurs. हाम्रो कुन लोजिकमा चाहिँ एरर छ हेर्नुस् त. Here an error in logic occurs because the minor premise refers to a term in the major premise that is undisturbed. It covers only some of the items in the class it denotes. To be valid, the minor premise must refer to the term in the major premise that is distributed. It covers all the items in the class it denotes. In the major premise, dogs is the distributed terms. It designates all dogs. Dog भन्ने बित्तिकै सबैलाई यसले represent गर्ने भयो. The minor premise, however, refers to animals, which is undistributed because it refers only to animals that are dogs. त्यस्ता एनिमलहरू जुन कुकुर हुन् तिनलाई मात्र represent गर्ने भयो. All the minor premises establishes Ralph is an animal, but it does not logically follow that he is a dog. It could be a cat, a horse, or even a human being. Even if a syllogism is valid, that is correct in its form, its conclusion will not necessarily be true. The following syllogism draws a false conclusion. केलाई false conclusion निकाल्छ त हेर त. Let's see here example. Major premise, all dogs are brown. Minor premise, my poorly Toby is a dog. Therefore, Toby is brown. Toby brown नै हुनुपर्छ भन्ने त छैन नि. हो यस्तो भयो भने पनि यसले के गर्ने भयो? It will bring negative conclusion. It will bring the unnecessary conclusion which is not acceptable. So, As it happens, Toby is a black. Conclusion is false because the major premise is false. Many dogs are not brown. If Toby were actually brown, the conclusion would be correct, but only by chance, not by logic to be sound. A syllogism must be both logical and true. Syllogism त के हुन्छ logical र true दुवै हुनुपर्ने हुन्छ. So here we are going to talk about self-evidence too. The advantage of deductive argument is that if your audience accepts your major and minor premise, the force of logic should bring them to grant your conclusion. Therefore, you should try to select premises that you know your audience accepts or that are self-evident or that are self-evident. That is, premises that most people believe to be true. Do not assume, however, that most people refers only to your friends and acquaintances. Consider to those who may hold different views. If you think your premises are too controversial or difficult to establish firmly, you should use inductive reasoning. हाम्रो हामीले युज गरेका यस्ता रिजनिङहरू छन् and if we find ourselves that it is not well and it is not going to be true and it is not going to be contextual and reasonable, then we easily can say, we easily can remove that condition and change it into the correct one. Now, using inductive argument, how can we use inductive argument? Unlike deduction, induction has no distinctive form. यस्तै गरी गर्ने भन्ने त छैन, and its conclusions are less definitive than those of syllogisms. So, induction has no deductive form and its conclusions are less definitive than those of syllogisms. Still, much inductive thinking tends to follow a particular process. Inductively, there are certain particular process that we can utilize. First, you decide on a question to be answered, or especially in the science, tentative answers to such a question called hypothesis. First, you go for hypothesis. Hypothesis भनेको के हो? It is not correct always and it may not be logical and true always. Hypothesis भनेको just we think. हामीले hypothetic गर्ने आकलन गर्ने मात्रै हो. Then you gather the evidence that is relevant to the question. क्वेसनसँग रिलेभेन्ट कुराहरूलाई ग्यादर गर्नुहोस् and that may be important to finding the answer. Finally, you move from your evidence to your conclusion. हाम्रो evidenceबाट conclusionमा अन्त्यमा जाने by making an inference, a statement about the unknown based on the known. Unknown based सँगसँगै known सम्म पुग्ने that answers the question and takes the evidence into account. जुनले क्वेसनलाई एन्सर गर्छ र हाम्रो इभिडेन्सले अकाउन्टसम्म लैजाने काम गर्छ. Here is a very simple example of inductive process. Question: how did the living room window get broken? हो छ्याल कसरी फुट्यो त? Evidence: there is a baseball on the living room floor. हो त्यो बलले फुटाएको हुन सक्छ. It's a hypothesis now. The baseball was not there this morning. बिहान थिएन, दिउँसो खेल्दै आउँदा पर्यो. Some children were playing baseball this afternoon. They were playing in the vacant lot across from the window. Because of this, the window of the living room has been broken. It is just a hypothesis. It is not a reality and evident. So, deduction is not induction is different than this. Induction चाहिँ यो भन्दा फरक हुने रहेछ. We knew it. No, induction चाहिँ we can just think it as a hypothesis and hypothesis may not be always correct. त्यो बलले नै फुटायो त भन्न सकिँदैन. So they stopped playing a little while ago. They aren't in the vacant lot now. Conclusion: one of the children hit or threw the ball through the window. Then they all ran away. The conclusion: because it takes all of the evidence into account, no, all of the evidence into account, That seems obvious, but if it turned out that the children had been playing volleyball, not baseball, this additional piece of evidence would make the conclusion doubtful. This additional piece of evidence, जुन additional छ, that piece of evidence that would make the conclusion doubtful. Even if the conclusion is believable, यदि हामीले conclusionलाई मान्ने हो भने पनि, you cannot necessarily assume it is true. After all, the window could have been broken in some other way. अरू कुनै तरिकाले फुटेको नि हुन सक्छ. For example, perhaps a bird flew against it, चरा उड्यो होला, and perhaps the baseball in the living room had gone unnoticed all day, making the second piece of evidence on the list not true. Considering several possible conclusions is a good way to avoid reaching an unjustified or false conclusion. In the preceding example, the hypothesis like this one might follow the question. कस्तो hypothesis हुन सक्छ त? One of those children playing baseball broke the living room window. Many people stop reasoning at this point without considering the evidence. But when the gap between your evidence and your conclusion is too great, evidence र conclusion को बिचमा हुने gap जब धेरै हुन्छ, means which do not get linked. कति कुरा लिङ्कै हुँदैन तर हामीले भनिरहन्छौँ नि. You may reach to the conclusion that is not supported by the fact. This well-named error is called jumping to the conclusion. यस्तो खालको गलत हामी जब गर्छौँ त्यसलाई हामी jumping to the conclusion we will name it because it amounts to a premature inductive leap. In induction, the hypothesis is merely the starting point. The rest of the inductive process continues as if the question were still to be answered, as in fact it is until all the evidence has been taken into account. Sabe evidence, how we go to the account. This is the next one. So, because inductive arguments tend to be more complicated than the example on page 535 and 36, you can go forward to see it. Of course, the more pertinent information you gather, the smaller the gap between your evidence and your conclusion. Still, whether large or small, the crucial step from evidence to conclusion always involves what is called an inductive leap. के हो त inductive leap भनेको कुरा हामीले त्यहाँ बुझ्छौँ. For this reason, it is important to remember that inductive conclusion are just to interference and opinions. Inductive भनेको जति पनि inductive leapहरू भनेर भनिन्छ त्यो चाहिँ के हो? That is just our opinion which is not with fact. जहाँ चाहिँ सत्य तथ्य कुराहरू राखिँदैन तर हाम्रो जस्ट विचार मात्रै के opinion. Therefore, inductive conclusion are never certain, only highly probable. हुन सक्छ तर inductive conclusionहरू कहिले पनि certain true हुँदैन. यही हो भनेर हामीले भन्न पनि सक्दैन inductive conclusions. But it could be, हुन चाहिँ सक्छ. That is just more than our hypothesis. हाम्रो hypothesis नै भनेर मान्ने हो यसलाई. How our hypothetical events are and how we can think for it. That is only inductive one. So in argumentation मा हामीले के युज गर्ने भयौं? सबभन्दा धेरै लोजिक युज गर्ने भयौं. हाम्रो आफ्नो विचारहरू धेरै राख्ने भयौं जहाँ चाहिँ हामीले we use these logics and our intentions on the way how we start it. कसरी स्टार्ट गर्छौं, कसरी यसलाई युज गर्छौं, कसरी भन्छौं हैन, कसरी हाम्रो राइटिङलाई एज अ प्रुफको रूपमा we provide the evidence over there. तर यसले चाहिँ के गर्ने भयो? It always marks the reality and objection over there. Reality र objection लाई without evidence. यो साइन्स जस्तो अरु जस्तो चाहिँ के हुँदैन, रियलिटी बेस्ड चाहिँ हुँदैन आर्गुमेन्टेटिभ एसेमा. र हामीले इन्डक्सन र डिडक्सनको कुराहरू गर्यौं. Once you read it please class, and we will continue it on next day and probably we will finish it and start the essay. Okay class?
Okay.
Thank you class. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye everyone.
Bye, ma'am.